What does it mean for something to be handmade, artisan, crafted, bespoke? Alexander Langlands will join us to discuss Craeft, an inquiry into the origins and true meaning of traditional crafts. Might the Vietnam War have ended differently had Edward Lansdale held more sway? Max Boot will join us to talk about his new book, The Road Not Taken. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Alexander Langlands joins us now from Swansea University in Wales. He is the author of a new book, Craeft, an inquiry into the origins and true meaning of traditional crafts, reviewed this week on the cover of the book review. Alexander, thanks for being here.
You're absolutely welcome.
You have two very interesting job titles. You are both a medieval historian and an archaeologist. What does your day job look like?
It's mixed. You know, I work at a university, so I have all the sort of teaching and a kind of admin work that goes with teaching, which is probably about half of my job. And the other half of my job is researching and fieldwork as well as writing. So, you know, trying to find a balance between all of those and trying not to spend too much time in the office is increasingly difficult.
And the subject of your book, in large part. What is your area of expertise? What do you specialize in?
It's the early medieval period, but I do both the kind of physical, so archaeology and landscapes, as well as the documentary as well. But of course, you know, there's a big part of me that sits in rural crafts, in farming and in landscapes as well. So I wouldn't say I have a particular specialism. It's actually where a lot of those different specialisms overlap.
You've hosted also two BBC programs with these very enticing names, Victorian Farm and Edwardian Farm. I guess two shows that would not be made here in the U.S., but that I actually think would interest people. What were those programs about? What did you do?
Well, in the first case, Victorian Farm, what we did is we took this farm up in Shropshire, a county in England, and we took it back to the year 1880. And for a full calendar year, we ran that farm as it would have been run in the year 1880. And Edwardian Farm, the same kind of thing, but in the year 1910. They were great projects for me as an archaeologist, someone who'd spent a lot of time working outside on archaeological sites. It was great for me to actually kind of experience the past, if you like, rather than just dig up the remains of the past. And a lot of the ideas in the book, those programs really helped me to bring my kind of landscape knowledge, my knowledge of crafts, and my archaeological knowledge together with those experiences to tell stories about the things that I did, the practices, ancient crafts and traditional crafts.
So those shows, those programs led to the writing of this book?
In many ways, they're part of it. You know, it was that thinking through. We have this phrase called experimental archaeology on both sides of the Atlantic, where we conduct experiments in order to try and understand the archaeological remains, try and put flesh on the bones, if you like. And I like to see those programs as really big 12-month experimental archaeology projects where, you know, we're watching with a really critical eye what we're doing, using past skills, past technology, as a way of informing the archaeological record. But there's a lot of stories in there as well from when I worked as a commercial archaeologist for about 7 years. And a commercial archaeologist, what we do, obviously in Europe, we've got cities that are kind of 2,000 years old. So every time someone wants to build something in those cities, or in the countryside for that matter, an archaeologist has to go in and just check that there isn't something underground that's going to get ruined by that building. So that was one of my jobs, was to go in and to just excavate. And, you know, we couldn't choose what we find. That's the nature of the beast. You know, you'd pull back the kind of topsoil and then you'd find maybe a bit of medieval, a bit of Roman, a bit of prehistory in there. And I did that for 7 years, so lots of experiences there thinking about past societies and about the material remains of past societies.
What was the most amazing thing you came upon, I guess, for whether it was a residential high-rise or whatever the project may have been?
Well, so when you're digging in the centre of something like the City of London or Southampton, Bristol, I did quite a lot of work in all three of those cities. You're looking at about 4 metres of deposits that are built up over 2,000 years. So you're going down a considerable depth, hugely complex, difficult to read. So some of the most impressive archaeology came from those places. One of the most moving sites I ever excavated was a suicide burial in a churchyard in England. So if you imagine it's a beautiful English churchyard, wonderful English summertime, excavating on the very edge of that churchyard, we found a burial of a young lady who had been buried north-south instead of being buried east-west, as was traditional for Christian burials. She was also buried across the boundary of the consecrated ground. So she was neither in this world nor in the next. And they'd used a certain type of stones, what we call pillow stones, which is very delicately worn stones from the bottom of a stream bed. They'd used pillow stones to turn her head away from the church, and that was a way of articulating in death the fact that she'd rejected the salvation of the Lord in life. And I remember excavating that skeleton and cleaning her up meticulously, her bones, that is, for photographing. And I just remember for a moment just a connection with this poor young girl who, what could possibly have happened in her life for her to have taken it, and the burial and the family, it's all there. And just for a few seconds you feel those emotions. So it's very, archaeology can be very powerful.
Going back to the programs you mentioned, the Victorian farm and Edwardian farm, I mean, it's a relatively, in terms of the archaeological record, there's a sort of short period of time between those two periods in English history. How much did farming change? How different were those programs?
Well, that's the interesting thing. When we made Victorian Farm, when we were making it, we thought, there's a cranky bunch of historians and archaeologists here out in the field dressed as Victorians. Who's going to want to watch this? And to our amazement, when the programme went out, it got just under 6 million viewers. It was incredibly popular. I mean, history programmes just don't get those kind of viewers. And I think it's because we were mixing the format up. It was a bit hybrid, and, we just were doing something different. And, of course, very naturally, the BBC says, we want the same, we want the same thing. And in many ways, it was their idea with the production company and in discussion with ourselves about doing the Edwardian period. And I sort of had to say, look, Queen Victoria dies, Edward comes to the throne. People don't start radically changing the way they're farming the landscape. But by moving to a different part of the country, we were able to unpack different stories. And we moved to the southwest of England there. It's a very different terrain. It's very much more coastal. There's a lot more mining going on in the landscape at that time. So, we were able to tell a whole different raft of stories. But, seen as one, we did wartime farm as well. So, again, not a lot of changes, but set in the backdrop of the Second World War, they all have their own different stories, those stories to tell.
I imagine, given what you said earlier, that many of the things that you did or that you highlighted, the kind of work done on these farms, ended up being incorporated into your book, Craeft.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I know we're talking about Victorian farms. We're talking about only 150 years ago. But at the same time, the hedging practices, the ditch digging practices, managing livestock, turning the soil over to grow cereals, these are technologies, crafts and skills that are thousands of years old. And for me, it was that window into what I call the deep time signatures of our crafting past. That there are many things in the book that I talk about which were being practiced as recently as the early 20th century, but that we have archaeological evidence for way back into prehistory.
So listeners of this program who haven't seen or read your book will not realize that there's something very particular about the title of this book, which I don't think is pronounced differently, but you choose to call the book Craeft, C-R-A-E-F-T. What is Craeft in that rendition of it, and how does it differ from our traditional spelling of craft, and what did you mean by it in the title?
Well, what I meant by using that word is that I'm trying to capture what I think you can call as a lost knowledge, or at least a disconnect that there is in society today. For a long time, I'd been looking at ancient crafts and the way of resourcing life, sustainability. How did people get on in the past? How did they survive? Mm-hmm. They had some kind of skill or wisdom, and actually I was reading the works of King Alfred, who he undertook, King Alfred, after he defeated the Vikings, he settled down to then educate this fledgling English nation. And we're talking over 1,000 years ago. And to do so, he translated a lot of classical documents into Old English. In those translations that he makes, he uses the word Craeft to gloss or to translate for Latin words for power, strength, knowledge, wisdom, and in some cases skill. So Alfred's use of the term is not just about making. It's not just about getting some materials and making something beautiful. It's actually about something else. It's about a wisdom. It's about a knowledge. And when I realised that was the old meaning of Craeft, then it just kind of sort of epiphany. I thought that's what the book should be called, because that's what it's really all about. It's about this wisdom and this knowledge and this skill that we used to have before the digital age, before the age of power, if you like, industrial power. And I wanted to get a sense of that in the title, because it does run through the book. There's a disconnect in our lives today between ourselves as makers and what we do on a day-to-day basis, and it's not healthy. And I am so delighted, actually, that that's what Michael Beirut, in his review, picks up on. I'm hugely honoured to have him even reading the book, let alone writing about it. But the fact that he picks up on this disconnect again, once again, over in the US, you guys, you've really, I think you're onto a new thing here. That this is an evil in society today. That there's so much disconnect between ourselves as makers and our day-to-day lives.
When you think about an academic and you hear the words medieval historian and even the word archaeologist, which I know in practice is often not field work, but is very much at a desk. How has getting more involved and hands-on in this kind of work changed your life? I'm assuming you the amount of time you spend desk-bound versus doing these other things, has that proportion has shifted. And I'm curious how that's impacted the rest of your life.
The amount of time I spend at a desk has increased, and I'm not overly happy about it. But, I also have very young children now, so I have to be I can't just go off for 3 weeks and sleep in a church tower somewhere whilst I'm making hay anymore. Or at least if I did, my wife would have something to say about it. But I think it's more about partnerships now. I mean, I'm in partnerships with various individuals about setting up projects which actually take a more formal approach to experimental archaeology. Because, a lot of my knowledge is, in some ways it's anecdotal, or any craftsperson's knowledge is anecdotal. How do we use it? How do we reference it? How do we bring that into the academic world? And I think a lot of archaeologists in academia are keen to do that. I think a lot of people in craft theory are keen to do that. So I'm actually quite keen to explore ways in which we can give academic voice to the people that have spent their life engaged in crafts and have the tacit knowledge, if you like, that they can bring to bear on our understanding of past societies. So that's an ambition. But, if I was to be honest with you, I'd really love to be in my workshop now, finishing off a little stool that I've been making. I'd love to spend all day crafting, hedging, dry stone walling and doing all that stuff. But unfortunately, I can't.
What are we losing that so many of us are no longer engaged in this kind of craft work?
I think skills, I think manual skill is something, and an understanding of material properties. I don't think we're sitting on the edge of an apocalyptic world, although sometimes if you read the news you'd think we were. So we might not all have to sort of fend for ourselves in the wilderness. But, those simple haptic skills, physical skills, and, I'm a patron of the Heritage Crafts Association, and one of the stories we often tell as part of the Heritage Crafts Association and teaching crafts in education is that, you can go to medical school and read everything there is to read on how the eye functions. But to be an eye surgeon, you have to be really skilled. You have to have craft skills. So this is not about undertaking crafts for the sake of having something to do at the weekend or a little hobby to keep us entertained. Craft skills, manual skills are a key part of the knowledge base that we need for vibrant economies as well, and creative economies. So those human elements, I think, are really important, not just for well-being, but for economic and diversity within the economic base.
That brings us, I think, very succinctly back to the subtitle of your book, which is an inquiry into the origins and true meaning of traditional crafts. The book, again, is called, is it Craeft? Is that the right pronunciation?
Yeah, Craeft or Craft.
Okay. I think I'm going to get that wrong. Craeft by Alexander Langlands. Alexander, thank you so much again for joining us.
You're welcome.
Max Boot joins us now. His new book is called The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam. Max, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the obvious question. For those who don't know, who was Edward Lansdale?
Edward Lansdale was a legendary secret agent who was said to be the model for both the quiet American and the ugly American. He was somebody who masterminded the defeat of a communist insurgency in the Philippines in the early 1950s and then went to Saigon in 1954 and helped to create the state of South Vietnam. And later, he was a very frustrated critic of U.S. policy in Vietnam because he didn't think that we were going to win with bombs and bullets. He thought we needed to have an idea that would compete with the communist idea. And sadly, he was ignored by the Lyndon Johnson administration. And so what I do in the book is I really tell the story of our involvement in Vietnam through the life of Edward Lansdale, who was there in the very beginning and who was there through the Tet Offensive in 1968.
So let's start with his early life, because I think people are always interested in, how does one get to be a covert intelligence agent? Where is he from, and what was his childhood like and education?
He had a very unusual background. He was certainly not to the manner born. He was not somebody who went to Harvard and then a white shoe law firm. He was not kind of a typical wise man of the post-war foreign policy establishment. His father was an automotive executive in the early days of the automobile industry, and they had a very up and down life, moving around a lot. He spent most of his childhood in California and went to UCLA, dropping out before graduating. He dreamed of becoming a New Yorker writer or cartoonist, went to New York in the height of the Great Depression, and like many young men at the time, his dreams died amid the economic misery.
Did he ever draw a cartoon?
He did draw cartoons, and I actually have one of the cartoons in my book he was part of this satirical newspaper at UCLA. But then, giving up his dreams of becoming this playwright or cartoonist, he went into advertising and had a successful advertising career in California in the 1930s. And then, of course, World War II came along. He wanted to enlist, could not get into the Army because he was over age. So he joined the OSS, the first civilian intelligence agency, and spent the war years largely in the United States, interviewing travelers about places where Allied troops would shortly be landing. Then he got into the Army and in 1945 was sent to the Philippines, where his career as a counterinsurgent and a nation builder really took off.
And he was at that time married with 2 kids, but he started an affair. Or was it with a Filipino woman? Was it during that period in the Philippines?
Yes, it was. I mean, this is one of the most important relationships in his life and one that has remained veiled until now. And I was lucky enough to get my hands on the love letters that he wrote to his longtime mistress and eventually his second wife, Pat Kelly, who was a war widow that he met in the Philippines in 1945. And she was incredibly important to him and to his, not just his personal life, but also his professional life. And this is part of the story of Edward Lansdale that has never been told before because nobody else had access to these letters. And what emerges very quickly is that Pat Kelly was this very vivacious professional career woman, this single mother, this very independent woman, very unusual Filipina for the 1940s. And she was literally from the area where the Hooks, the communist insurgents in the Philippines, were located in Luzon province. That was basically her home turf. And she offered to take Ed Lansdale, who was then a young major in Army intelligence, out into the boondocks to meet these rebels. And as they went on these adventures, some of which were quite dangerous, a romance took off. And this would be in many ways the most important relationship of his life, even though his wife blocked him from getting a divorce. They had a long 10-year relationship, which eventually broke off. But then at the end of the day, in 1972, when his wife finally died, within a year, Pat Kelly, who had never married and by then was retired from her job at the U.S. Embassy in Manila, moved to the United States and married Ed Lansdale, and then they lived happily ever after until he died of natural causes in 1987.
How'd you get the love letters?
Well, you know what? I just asked for them. I mean, what I did was I actually tracked down Pat Kelly's descendants. Her daughter is dead now, but her grandchildren are still around, some of whom live in the Washington area, another one of whom lives in Manila. And so I went and talked to them, and I said, hey, I'm telling the story of Ed Lansdale, and do you have anything that would be helpful? And they said, well, would you be interested in these letters? And I said, oh my God, would I?
Yeah.
This is amazing. I mean, this is the kind of, biographical goldmine that authors really just dream about.
And what did you glean from those letters? I mean, was it getting more of a sense of him as a person and his personal side, or did he write about work, and did you get insight into his career from them?
Well, it was really an unparalleled insight into his innermost thinking. And I should add, I didn't just have the letters that he wrote to his mistress/second wife. I also have the letters that he wrote to his first wife, which nobody else has had access to either. And so often he was writing simultaneously to both women, and I'm reading both sets of letters. I mean, it's pretty interesting because in the early years, in the late 40s, early 50s, as you might imagine, the letters to Pat Kelly, the mistress, tend to be of the more heavy-breathing variety and endless repetitions of how much he loves her and, really actually sweet love letters. He would often have little drawings that he would put at the top of the letters because, remember, he was an aspiring cartoonist. His letters to his wife tended to be more factual and more descriptive of his work environment. And in some ways, that was more helpful to me in just describing what he was up to professionally. But there's no question that these Pat Kelly letters reveal this incredible passion and true love that he always tried to hide throughout his life. And it's very interesting because he published his memoir in 1972 at a time when his first wife was still alive. So there was basically no mention of Pat Kelly in that whole book.
So this period in the Philippines was a career success for him. This is sort of what launched his career. What exactly did he accomplish there?
Well, he had two tours in the Philippines, one from 1945 to 1948, and then a second one from 1950 to 1954. And it was really the 50 to 54 tour that established the legend of Ed Lansdale, although the earlier years laid the foundation for that because he was really learning about the Philippines. He was learning about the culture and the people of the Philippines with help from Pat Kelly. In 1950, what was going on in the world was that from the perspective of Washington, there was a feeling that we were losing the Cold War because the Korean War was underway. China had just fallen to the communists. The Soviet Union had acquired the atomic bomb. And there was tremendous fear and concern in Washington about what was going to happen in the Philippines, where you had a very active communist insurgency, the Hook Rebellion, that appeared to be on the verge of success. But there was no desire to send large numbers of army troops because we were already bogged down in the Korean War. So instead of sending multiple divisions, the CIA sent Ed Lansdale and a handful of assistants, and their job was defeat the communist insurgency, which is a pretty tall order. But he actually pulled it off. And the way he did it was by cultivating a fellow named Ramon Magsaysay, who had just been appointed defense minister, and they became as close as brothers. Together, they really pioneered what eventually came to be known as counterinsurgency, this notion that the army should not be using artillery and airplanes and bombarding barrios and killing civilians. Instead, Lansdale preached they needed to be the brothers to the people. They needed to win the trust of the people. And if they won the trust of the people, then the people would rat out the insurgents to them. And that was essentially the strategy that he convinced Magsaysay to follow, and complemented finally by holding free and fair elections. And Ed Lansdale served as de facto campaign manager to Ramon Magsaysay in the 1953 presidential election. I mean, one of the fascinating declassified documents I read was his top secret report to Alan Dulles, the CIA director, on how do you win an election, and he spelled it all out there. But at the end of the day, in 1953, Ramon Magsaysay, who was this honest, not corrupt reformer who was very popular with the Filipino people, won the presidency. And that basically took all the air out of the Hook balloon. The communist insurgency basically withered and went away because they no longer needed to fight in order to achieve change, because here was a reformer who was actually going to achieve change through the peaceful constitutional process. And so that was one of the most important and least known Cold War victories for the United States, and that made Lansdale really the flavor of the month in Washington. He became a great favorite of Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles. And so it was natural in 1954, when they were looking at the situation in Indochina. The French had just been defeated in Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam was being split between North and South, with Ho Chi Minh and the communists in control of the North. And the question was, well, what happened to South Vietnam? How would you create a non-communist state? And so it was natural, after Ed Lansdale's success in the Philippines, they basically said, let's send Ed Lansdale. Let's ask Ed to do what he did in the Philippines.
So they send him to South Vietnam, where he becomes a big supporter of Diem. I mean, was he a true believer in Diem, or did he sort of see him as a kind of corrupt and compromised leader who nonetheless was the best chance that Vietnam had?
It's absolutely correct to say that in 1954, Ed Lansdale embraced Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the newly appointed prime minister of of South Vietnam and at a time when few people thought he would last 9 weeks, much less 9 years. And Lansdale really orchestrated Ziem's attempts to consolidate power, but not in a heavy-handed kind of way. I mean, he really wanted Ziem to rule in a consensual fashion to win the support of the people, and he pushed back against some of his autocratic tendencies. I mean, he was very aware of the fact that Ziem was not a charismatic Democrat like Ramon Magsaysay had been in the Philippines, that he was somebody who was much more of a Confucian Mandarin who was reclusive and shy. But he also, I saw some positive qualities in Ziem that others did not discern, because he thought that Ziem was personally honest and personally committed to the people of Vietnam. He was not corrupt, and he had some legitimacy as a nationalist because he had opposed both the communists and the French. And so even though Lansdale was often argued with Ziem and was very aware of his flaws, his judgment was that there was no better alternative if you were going to consolidate a non-communist South Vietnam.
You mentioned earlier that some of your research came from declassified documents, and I'm wondering, is there an equivalent on the Vietnam side? Has there been an opening up of the archives in the way that there has in the former Soviet Union, where you can now get access to sort of what was going on the Vietnamese side?
No, not from the Vietnamese side. I mean, remember, Vietnam is still a communist dictatorship. I mean, they've liberalized in recent years. I mean, they've become market reformers like in China, but they still control the flow of information pretty tightly. I mean, there has been a release of some documents from the Vietnamese side, and they've published some official publications, which are actually pretty interesting that I read. For example, the official history of the Vietnam War from the People's Army of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not this wide open, throw open the archives and ransack through them. I mean, I did have a Vietnamese researcher who helped me to look through the Vietnamese archives for material relating to Lansdale, and there's very little that's open there. But I mean, I should add, by the way, that this is not entirely a one-sided Vietnamese problem, because on the American side, we're pretty stingy with documents too. And it's just staggering to me that it's only in the last few years that some of Lansdale's top secret papers from the 1950s have been declassified. I mean, there's no reason to keep these documents secret for 50 or 60 years. There's no operational purpose that's served by this. It's just inertia and just knee-jerk secretiveness.
For those who are not familiar, Max is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of 2 previous books on military history, Invisible Armies and
The Savage Wars of Peace, Small Wars and the Rise of American Power.
How did you get interested in Lansdale's story?
Well, I wrote a little bit about Ed Lansdale in my previous book, Invisible Armies, which was a history of guerrilla warfare down through the ages. And it was really my editor's idea, Bob Weil at Norton Liveright, who is a fantastic editor. And Bob said, you should really do a whole book on Ed Lansdale. And I said, well, I've already done him. Why would I want to write more about him? And Bob just intuited that there was a lot more to say about Lansdale. And he was right, because as I was saying, I found these love letters he had written, these letters he had written to his wife, all these newly declassified documents. And even though Ed Lansdale has been written about a lot, nobody's ever written about him, I think, with the kind of depth and nuance that I've tried to bring to the project. And I was able to do because I was really focusing in on him. He wasn't just a page or two. I mean, he's the whole book. And I've really brought out aspects of his story that have never been told before.
I don't know if there's any analogies we could make to the very current moment in Washington and our foreign policy there, but I would imagine that you do. And is there anything that Ed Lansdale could sort of help inform the Trump administration in terms of its current foreign policy challenges?
Well, I think one of the big lessons from Edward Lansdale is how to engage with the local population. And it's very much at odds with the normal American approach, which we see today just in the case of Pakistan, where we're frustrated with Pakistan, so we're cutting off aid. And one thing that, Lansdale noted is we tend to be either overly generous or overly strict. And we're either, throwing out bags of cash, or we're laying down non-negotiable demands and taking away our money. And Ed Lansdale's view was neither approach really worked. What you had to do was to offer friendship. You had to learn about the local population. You had to find people that you like and cultivate and become genuine friends with, in the way that he did with Ramon Magsaysay in the Philippines and No Dinh Diem in South Vietnam. And this is really the key to it, you have to listen to them. This is not something we do very often because we like to lecture, right?
Right.
But Ed Lansdale liked to listen. And this was not always easy, because somebody like, No Dinh Diem was notorious for his hours-long monologues that bored the pants off of most Americans. I mean, they were dying to get out of his office after listening to him opine for 3 hours about the minutia of South Vietnamese politics. But Ed Lansdale had endless patience and I think probably a pretty strong bladder. And he would sit there hour after hour listening very carefully. And at the end of that, he would say, "Oh, thank you. I understand what you're saying. If I understand correctly, what you're saying is X, Y, and Z." And then he would very subtly rephrase what his interlocutor had told him, basically putting across his own ideas as if they were the ideas of the person he was talking to. Very, very simple method. It's not rocket science, but it's not something we do very often. But it's actually very effective. And it was through this kind of friendship and listening that Ed Lansdale was able to be very effective in influencing leaders like Magsaysay Sai and ZM. And that's something we've lacked in recent years, where we've often been at odds with our allies like Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan or Nouri al-Maliki in Iraq. We really need, I think more of those Lansdale skill sets, because we're not going to win the war on terrorism by sending American troops. There's no appetite for hundreds of thousands of American troops in the Middle East. The way we're going to do it is by sending American advisors, people who can, small groups, teams of advisors who can go to these countries and work with local leaders to try to buttress their own capabilities to fight our mutual adversaries. And I think those advisors could do a lot worse than to study the methodology of Ed Lansdale.
Well, I'm not entirely certain that the current administration is going to take that wise approach.
That may be a tall order.
Yes.
That may be wishful thinking on my part.
All right. Well, the book again is The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam by Max Boot. Max, thanks again for being here.
Pleasure to be on.
Alexander Alter joins us now with notes from the publishing world. Alexander, hi.
Hi, Pamela.
So there's this little book that came out last week.
Yes.
That some people are talking about.
Some people are talking about this book that has caused, a good amount of fury. It's Michael Wolff's Fire and Fury. And it's not often that you have the president of the United States engaging in a very public feud with a publishing house and author. And it turns out to be a very effective sales strategy. I don't know if they planned it that way, but Henry Holt, which is publishing the book, reported this week that it has received a massive boost in orders from retailers for more than 1 million copies of the book.
And the book debuted at number 1 on our bestseller list.
I'm not surprised. It's been on the top of Amazon for a while. He's been sort of a staple on all the news channels and late night shows and, of course, the 24-hour cable networks. It's kind of remarkable. Even North Korean state media has endorsed the book and said the book's popularity, quote, foretells Trump's political demise.
I have to say that you think about authors so desperate to get media attention for their books, to get on just one TV show in order to boost sales. And then, of course, it's a book that needs no boosting of sales that actually gets on every single TV show and radio show.
I'm sure there are a lot of authors wondering now how they could possibly provoke the president into issuing a cease and desist order against their book.
What can I possibly do with my new poetry collection?
Exactly. But what's interesting is Henry Holt, I think, maybe wasn't prepared for the amount of interest, even though I think they were pretty confident that they had a very explosive book that would get a lot of attention when it came out. Their first printing that they had planned for was 150,000 copies. So you hold that up against 1 million orders, and you can imagine they're very shorthanded right now.
Well, also, there are the first printings that they announce are often inflated.
Somewhat inflated often, it's true. And, they usually say, well, we know there'll be a lot of audiobooks and ebooks. So even given the way publishers typically lowball their first printings, I think they massively underestimated the amount of interest this book would get. They were sort of caught shorthanded over the weekend. They moved up the publication date, which also, I think, impeded sales a little bit because, a lot of the books hadn't shipped yet. So for the first weekend, they sold 29,000 hardcover copies. That's according to BookScan. And retailers have had a lot of trouble keeping it in stock, so they're working very hard to ship more copies.
BookScan numbers capture about 70% of the
I think it's around
sales?
85% of print.
Okay.
And Holt said that digital and audio sales have also been incredibly high. Those have topped 350,000 copies collectively.
Trump narrates, right?
Actually, Alec Baldwin WikiLeaks posted a pirated copy online. I spoke to the CEO of Macmillan, which is Holt's parent company, this week, and he was pretty transparently pleased, I think, and surprised, I would say, by the reaction that the book's gotten, certainly with an assist from the president and his lawyer. While they've been scrambling, they've also, I think, been pretty savvy in how they've handled all the publicity and all the ire coming out of the White House. And the first thing they did when they received the cease and desist order was call a meeting, of course, with their top executives to see, well, how do we respond to this? And their decision was to move up the publication of the book.
Mm-hmm.
When I spoke to John Sargent, the CEO, he said they did that for several reasons. One was simply to make it available because everyone was talking about it. But he also said pretty pointedly he wanted to send a message to the president that we are coming. This book is coming out regardless of what kind of threats you issue. So that was pretty interesting. He also sent a letter out to all the employees of Macmillan, essentially explaining their rationale for standing up to the president and making a strong First Amendment case for it.
It was interesting because I saw Michael Wolff on Colbert, and Colbert asked him, were you surprised by the reaction? And he said, absolutely. He said, well, how could you be surprised? Like, here you are, you're saying that the president is unfit, that he's mentally unstable, that he's an idiot, and that everyone around him basically agrees. How could you not know that this would cause a sort of firestorm? And Wolf's response was, I thought we all knew this.
Oh, wow.
I thought we all knew this, like this is not surprising. It's just confirmation.
I mean, he's been transparently delighted by this reaction.
Well, I think anyone whose book goes to number one in a matter of microseconds is going to be delighted.
Absolutely. But he also said it proves the point of his book that Trump would overreact. On the other hand, it's not getting universal praise from critics, we should point out. There are people pointing out various errors in it or rumors that other media outlets kind of were fed but passed on because they weren't confirmed. He's a little, I think, looser with the facts and anecdotes than many newspaper reporters or magazine reporters might be. And I think, part of that is to give this full picture of what's going on inside the White House as this very undisciplined place where there's conflicting realities and truths and accounts. And he claims that, that was very deliberate, that he would include accounts from people that he knew to be perhaps untrue, but that's what they were saying. So he's sort of trying to give that sense of just these competing narratives that are coming out of the White House. But I did ask John Sargent about that, and I said, people are pointing out errors, and how do you plan to handle those? He said they would correct anything that was demonstrably false, but so far he said they only found a typo.
Wow.
I'm not sure about that, but
all right.
In any case, they are standing by this book, and we'll see how quickly it continues to sell.
Can anyone just go and get this book now, or is it just sold out everywhere?
It's coming back into stock in a lot of bookstores, so they are being pretty quick about printing and resupplying, so it should be available pretty shortly if it's out in some places.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
We have something really exciting to tell you about here coming up, which is a new book club, Now Read This. It's a collaboration between us here at the New York Times and the PBS NewsHour. And what will happen is there is a Facebook page, you can go online and find it, called the Now Read This Book Club. Every month we're going to be picking a new book, and readers can submit questions for the author and learn more about the book and the author online. At the end of every month, there'll be an interview on air on the PBS NewsHour with the author, and it will include many of your questions. So this is really a participatory book club, and we're super excited to announce the first author on the book club and the first book choice, which is Jesmyn Ward's Sing Unburied Sing. I think many of our listeners here and readers of the New York Times Book Review will be familiar with this book. Of course, it was one of our 10 best books of 2017, and it won the National Book Award. And just a few more things about Jesmyn Ward. I won't go into the book too much because hopefully you will discover it yourselves. But Jesmyn is kind of an amazing figure. She is the first woman to win the National Book Award twice for fiction. Her second novel, Salvage the Bones, won the National Book Award in 2011. And Jesmyn does not only write fiction, she also edited a great anthology, The Fire Next Time, that came out in 2016. And then that was an anthology of essays about race. And she has also written a memoir, very moving memoir, called Men We Reaped, about the death of her brother and 4 other young African-American men in Mississippi. She's just kind of a force and really writes about her community She's from Delisle, Mississippi, which is a small rural town. She's the first person in her family to go to college. She went on to go to Stanford. She was a Wallace Stegner Fellow, just 1,000,001 accomplishments, and she still lives down in Mississippi. And so we're very excited to have this novel, Sing Unburied Sing, as our first featured book, and look forward to having many of you participate. So again, you can find it on Facebook. It's called the Now Read This Book Club. And our first pick is, once again, Jesmyn Ward's Sing Unburied Sing. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles, John Williams, and in her debut, Tina Jordan, formerly of Entertainment Weekly, joins us here on What We're Reading. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's start with Greg. What have you got?
Well, I got sidetracked a little. After I finished Wallace Stegner's Angle of Repose, I intended to keep reading Stegner or other Western writers, and instead I picked up Hanif Qureshi's new novel.
Obvious transition.
It's called The Nothing, and it is a filthy novel. It's, almost pornographic in its sex, but it adds a layer of kind of consciousness to that because it's almost entirely imagined sex, not actual real sex. And the premise is the narrator of the book he's probably about 80 years old. He is in a wheelchair, in declining health. He needs a caregiver, but his wife is much younger. She's more than 2 decades younger than he is. In the full flush of life, he was a very
player.
Yeah, he was a player, exactly. He was a
John
typical Hanif Qureshi kind of character. And so his libido is as strong as ever, but he is precluded from using it in any way. And so instead he imagines that his wife and his caregiver are having an affair, and he tries to catch them in the act. He turns up his hearing aid. He kind of puts various spies out to find out what they can. And so it's very much his imagination about what's going on between these two. And so instead of really being a book about sex, it turns out to be a book about frustration and the torment of uncertainty, not knowing what's going on, and also very much about sex in a way that's great fun to read about. But it's kind of sex and death and the decline of the body.
Sounds like Sabbath's Theater.
Yeah,
the Philip Roth
it
novel.
has that going on, yeah.
This book got what we would call politely a negative review in the New York Times Book Review. So I'm curious what inspired you to pick it up nonetheless.
It is a little bit two-dimensional in its concerns. I picked it up partly because I was working on the review, but then I just got sucked into it, and it's a book about sex, so it's great fun to read about. And then I started to see the kind of textures there, the themes that he was working with that were not just the sex stuff that draws you in, I had more kind of admiration for the book and what Qureshi was doing with it.
All right, John, you've also got a book there that was reviewed by one of our critics this week.
I did. It was a positive review. Dwight Garner really liked it, although not as much as the previous one in the series. It's Ali Smith's new book, Winter, which is the second novel in her planned quartet based on the seasons. Autumn came out last year. It was one of our 10 best in the book review, and it was one of Dwight's favorite books of the year in his roundup of the year. And he says in the review, even though it's very positive, that he doesn't like it quite as much as he liked Autumn, which is, I'm sitting here questioning myself because Dwight and our former colleague Radhika Jones loved Autumn so much, and it was a quick read, and I got through it, and it was well written, but it left me a little cold. I found it a bit too abstract and brainy.
So winter leaves you less cold than autumn.
Winter leaves me less cold than autumn, yeah. I am a cold weather person. And this is not really connected, at least in any obvious way, to the first book, so you can read it independently. And it's about an older woman who lives in the English countryside in this giant house, and her son, who's this sort of very funny, hapless nature blogger, comes to visit her, and he's on the outs with his girlfriend, who he told his mother he would bring. And so he pays this woman that he meets in a train station to come and, pretend to be her. And then the mother's sister shows up because they're concerned about her health. And so you have these 4 characters in a big house and not getting along very well. And there are some magical realism elements. It opens with a giant head floating in front of the older woman, and she's sort of imagining it, seeing it in front of her. It eventually becomes real. It seems like something she can handle and pick up like a stone. But it's mostly kind of funny dialogue between these 4 people and their differences, and that's sort of what drives the book. And I found it a bit more charming and warm than the previous one, so I would recommend it.
I think nature blogger has to be one of the great oxymoronic job titles out there.
She's very funny about him and kind of gently mocking him and his pretensions. Tina, what about you?
Well,
Welcome aboard, first of all.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. I've interrupted my sort of 8th month quest to read comic novels and memoirs because I needed to just get away from everything. So that's what I had been doing. But I have a daughter who's in medical school now and finding myself unable to relate to what she was going through. Whenever I reach out, she's like, Mom, can't talk right now. Mom, I'll call you later.
Surely you can relate to that part of it.
That I can relate. That's true. So I've reached way back to 2 books about becoming a doctor. And the first one is A Not Entirely Benign Procedure. That's Perry Klass's book, and it's composed of her New York Times pieces, I guess from the 80s, about what it was like to be a woman at Harvard Medical School.
Longtime contributor, Perry Klass.
Yes. But, while I'm sure parts of medical school have changed, it's very clear that the parts about being a woman in science and medical school maybe have not changed all that much. Also, because these were newspaper columns, they sort of concentrate on the most sensational and flashy things like, getting your cadaver and things like all of which things I've heard about. And then the other one, and I'm not quite done with this yet, and it's also a collection of columns, is Atul Gawande's Better, A Surgeon's Notes.
He's fantastic.
He's amazing. And what this is a book about what separates very good doctors from just good doctors, like that razor-thin margin, and putting a real human face by telling stories like what malpractice is, and how can a really, really good doctor be sued for malpractice. And I feel like I'm getting these, I don't know, not only from both these books am I learning the lingo of medicine, which I did not know. By the way, do you know what 007 is? That's a dangerous medical school student, licensed to kill. So I'm learning the lingo, but more than that, I feel like I'm just understanding better what it means to be a doctor and what you go through just along with the grueling hours and, which my daughter's already going through even as a first year. So I think I'm coming away with more understanding.
Does the Gawande have much about medical school itself or just about the practice of medicine?
No, it's more about the practice of medicine. But I felt like because a lot of what he's talking about is the kind of thing that becomes ingrained in you when you are a medical student, that it made sense to read. Does that?
He talks about the ethics of things a lot and sort of how do you have to approach the practice. I mean, you just feel like you're learning so much when you read him, but he's such a brilliant storyteller that it's fun.
He's also talking a lot about underserved populations, which is what my daughter is really interested in. So to have a window into that and understand how not being able to receive medical care affects all these other parts of your life. He crystallizes that.
He's written a number of articles, long stories for The New Yorker on the healthcare system, but I feel like there was one, I read it, and it was so clear that at the end I was like, I not only understand the healthcare system, I can fix it. Right. But it then evaporated, of course.
But I think I know what article you're talking about. It was about 2 hospitals in one town in Texas and how one was this big fancy hospital. I felt the same way. Yes.
So now you will understand how to be a medical student and a doctor.
I'm way too squeamish. Way too squeamish.
What have you learned about this week and what you're reading, Pamela? What can you fix now?
I can solve murders because I have read A.J. Finn's The Woman in the Window, which, Tina, I know you read as well. This book it's very unusual because I have had a lifelong tendency to read massive bestsellers years later. I read A Civil Action something like 7 years later, and I felt like everyone I bumped into was going to be like, oh my God, isn't it amazing when he finds out? And I'm like, don't tell me. And so this is one instance in which I have read the number 1 best-selling book in the country, according to our bestseller list out this week, at the time that it's actually out. And weirdly, the number 1 best-selling nonfiction book is of course, Michael Wolff's Fire and Fury. And while I have not finished reading that, I've read some of it. So I don't know that I've actually been in this position before. The Woman in the Window is, people are there's a lot of buzz around it. It's been sold as a motion picture, and it's got lots and lots of publicity and buzz. And Janet Maslin reviewed it fairly favorably in the Times. And so people are kind of seeing it as the next girl on the train. They're like, it's been years now. We need the next girl on the train. And
which was itself the next
Gone Girl.
yeah.
Right. I'm pleased that at least the girl is now a woman. That's like a move in the positive direction. But what it does share in common with The Girl on the Train, obviously unreliable narrator in all three, unreliable women narrators, weird little over interest in that unreliable female narrator thing in this country, I think, overall. But what it really shares is that the reason for the unreliability is rampant alcohol and drug abuse. And I think I enjoyed the book. That was my major problem with it, which is that I just felt like it was such a convenient ploy to be like, I don't remember because I had 4 bottles of wine and, 30 Percocet. And actually also, I know that one shouldn't approach these kinds of psychological thrillers with too much need for factual accuracy. I don't feel like you could be taking that amount of drugs, prescription medication with that kind of alcohol and sort of not be dead. It was too much. Like there were points where the bottles were spilling over and she'd scoop up, handfuls of them and then didn't you?
You should be reading the medical books at the same time.
It was like that movie Leaving Las Vegas, that alcoholism movie where I felt it's too much, guys. You can't drink that much and not be dead, right?
Okay, but don't you remember how Girl on the Train, of course, she also drank?
Right, it's blackouts, right.
She drank gin and tonics that came out of a can. Like, that's what I remember. In England, they sell mixed drinks in cans. That's a weird aside, but I could not get that out of my head.
Yeah.
Why would you do that?
Yeah, no, it's...
Why not?
Why don't we do that, John wondered.
It sounds like neither of you were really suspending your disbelief quite enough for a book like this.
Well, my problem with the book was that I guessed it.
Oh, you did?
I guessed it. And we're not going to give anything away
We're not going to give anything away here.
It just came to me.
Well, what I will say is, and I can't even say who the actor was in the movie, but this was a movie, right? That we saw this once in a movie, and after you read the book, you're like, oh, which maybe makes sense because movies are a big theme in the book. This is a woman who is agoraphobic, and she is in her house in Harlem observing her neighbors. So you have this rear window thing going on. Yes. And she's also a fan of old movies. So she's watching all these movies and film noir in particular, and she's watching these old Hollywood classics. And there's this idea of the films blending with reality. Okay, one more reality check thing that did trouble me is having lived in a Harlem brownstone, which is where this book takes place, I found the setting unbelievable because as far as I could tell, everyone in Harlem in this book was white. And everyone in Harlem is not actually white, nor is everyone in a Harlem brownstone sort of upper middle class, upper class Manhattanite. That would sort of be more the Upper West Side. So, most Harlem blocks are still, despite gentrification, very mixed economically. You have a lot of different economic classes sort of intermingling. You have SROs and low-income housing on the same blocks as these sort of not even really multi-million, like barely multi-million-dollar brownstones. And you didn't get any sense of that from the book. It felt like the Upper West Side to me. But I will say this in its favor. I did read that thing in like one sitting, and I did not want to put it down.
It's a kind of book I call a milkshake. You just like guzzle it straight down, right? That's what you did.
All right. So we'll hopefully all continue to guzzle our books as we go into next week. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.